Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Cohn. Thank you very much for listening. This is part 16 of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled Counter-Revolution and Conspiracy. I do have a couple of brief housekeeping notes that I'd like to make at the top of this episode. First, I noticed while editing that this episode, at least in the first part, there's a bit of distortion in the audio. I did my best to fix the problem, but it might still be noticeable at certain points. Just know that I am aware of the problem. Second, there is a possibility that the next episode, which is currently scheduled to release on November 15th, might be a bit delayed. The script is already complete, but it is a very long episode, potentially over 2 hours long, and as such, the editing process might take more time than usual. I'll still do my best to get it out as close to the scheduled release date as possible, but I thought it was best to give you advance notice in case it's late. Anyway, that should about do it for now. Let's get on with the show. In the previous episode of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, we covered events from late 1807 to the autumn of 1815. To give a broad overview of events, in the mid to late 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, was at the height of his power, ruling an empire that spanned practically the entire European continent. Then came the outbreak of the guerrilla war in Iberia in 1810, and the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. Napoleon's armies, which once seemed invincible, were defeated. In 1814, the forces of the anti-French coalition, the Quadruple Alliance of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain, invaded France and forced the emperor to abdicate. The Allied powers subsequently restored the former ruling dynasty of France, the House of Bourbon, to power. The new king, Louis XVIII, proved unable to mitigate the societal unrest that accompanied this change of regimes, and within a matter of months, Napoleon returned to France intent on retaking the throne. With most of the French military firmly behind him, the king and his court were forced to flee Paris. The Quadruple Alliance, still in the process of determining the contours of the post-Napoleonic balance of power, declared Napoleon an outlaw, and mobilized to fight him once again. After a decisive defeat at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, Napoleon was compelled to abdicate for the second and final time, and was sent to live in exile on the remote island of St. Helena. In these years of national crisis, from 1814 to 1815, our protagonist, the Marquis de Lafayette, emerged from the semi-self-imposed retirement that he had been in since returning to France in 1799. The general had been rather critical of Napoleon for abandoning the principles of the French Revolution. The main reason why he had remained in retirement throughout Napoleon's rule, despite being repeatedly invited to serve in his government, was that he could not countenance serving a regime that he thought of as antithetical to his values. After Napoleon's defeat and first abdication in 1814, Lafayette was initially supportive of the restored Bourbon monarchy, so much so that he requested the new king, Louis XVIII, appoint him as commander of the National Guard once again, though this request went unanswered. This slight notwithstanding, Lafayette believed, or rather hoped, that the House of Bourbon had learned its lesson from the Revolution and would rule France in an accordingly enlightened way. Over the next several months, he observed as they tried to reverse the most positive and enduring changes brought about by the Revolution, instituting a regime far more reactionary and backwards-looking than Napoleon's had ever been. When the former emperor returned to France in March 1815, Lafayette raced to the capital ahead of him, hoping to somehow take advantage of the instability to advance his own agenda. In May, legislative elections were held in which Lafayette was elected as a representative of his home district. The liberal majority within the Chamber of Representatives quickly elected him as vice president of the chamber, which, while not a hugely powerful position, nonetheless gave him a platform which he used to voice the public's concerns to the emperor, and which he would eventually use to fatally undermine his authority. After the defeat at Waterloo in June, Lafayette was among the first public officials to openly call for Napoleon to step down. At his insistence, the legislature issued an ultimatum to the emperor to abdicate immediately and keep some dignity, or to be deposed. This had the intended effect, and Napoleon abdicated the throne on June 22nd. Upon being restored to power once more by the victorious Allies, the Bourbons initiated a violent purge of the government and military, targeting not only those who had assisted Napoleon during the 100 Days, but practically anyone they suspected of harboring disloyal views. Lafayette was spared persecution thanks in part to his popularity, and in part to the prominent role that he had played in ousting Napoleon. Still, he decided that it was best to avoid attracting undue attention to himself, and so he retired to his estate at Lagrange to wait out the storm. This is where we left off last time. Over the next few years, Lafayette, surrounded by his numerous children, sons and daughters-in-law, and grandchildren, settled back into his life as a gentleman farmer. Managing his estate and keeping up his correspondence with contacts across the world occupied most of his time. Like before, guests of all kinds called on the hero of two worlds at Lagrange, eager to meet this man who was a living symbol of liberty in this era of counter-revolution. Some of these guests were old friends and acquaintances, but a great many of them were aspiring revolutionaries of the younger generation, for whom the estate at Lagrange became like the site of a secular pilgrimage, a beacon on the hill. In a memoir published in 1831, one anonymous visitor to Lafayette's residence rhapsodizes about the general in terms that would certainly have made him blush. Quote, "He's the living expression of popular needs and interests, the flag of freedom, and the honored figure around whom patriots from all nations, fighting for the liberty of their own lands, gather to render homage to him, who is the leader of civilization, and to receive from him the investiture of liberty." End quote. Intentionally or otherwise, Lafayette helped to cultivate this image by his gracious manners and unpretentious conduct. He never turned visitors away and never lost his temper, even during the occasionally heated political discussions that he was host to. His personal physician, Jules Cloquet, wrote of Lafayette, quote, "Near him everyone sought knowledge, support, guidance, or consolation, a refuge from the ills of life." End quote. In many ways, Lagrange acted like a Paris salon in the pre-revolutionary period. It was a place for liberal-minded, politically active people from diverse backgrounds to meet, converse, and share ideas. When Sidney Lady Morgan, the Irish-born writer who I discussed 2 episodes ago, visited Lagrange in 1816 and again in 1818, she claimed to have encountered historians, physicians, political theorists, military officers, politicians, and artists. Cloquet, the physician, described being present for, quote, "intellectual exchanges that were extremely animated and interesting. At Lafayette's house, everybody was at ease, engaged in conversation, and even formed ties of friendship." End quote. In his book, Lafayette in Two Worlds, Public Cultures and Personal Identities in the Age of Revolutions, historian Lloyd Kramer makes the case that Lafayette became the focal point of a steadily growing network of figures from the political and cultural spheres that contributed greatly to the development of European, and to a lesser extent American, liberalism in the post-Napoleonic era. He writes, quote, "The combination of people and interests produced a diverse crowd of guests at Lafayette's home, but everyone recognized that Lafayette's fame attracted the crowd, and that his outspoken ideas shaped the political and intellectual consensus at the gatherings that he hosted." End quote. In later years, Lafayette would hold gatherings of the sort just described at his residence in Paris, where he attracted guests just as diverse as those that made the journey to Lagrange. That said, in the earliest days of the Second Bourbon Restoration, he understandably made an effort to avoid the capital. This did not mean that he completely ignored politics. If anything, he followed the news coming from the capital more closely now than he did during Napoleon's rule. The ultra-royalist violence of the White Terror continued for several months, well into the new year of 1816, before Louis XVIII ordered government officials to restore order with the help of the Allied occupation forces. On the political side of things, the king sought to rein in the legislature, concerned that their reactionary agenda would only engender greater resentment among the population. Frustrated by the obstructionism that gave the unobtainable chamber its epithet, Louis ordered the chamber dissolved in September 1816. In advance of new elections that were to be held later that month, Louis altered the election laws to allow for a wider proportion of the middle class to vote. As a result, a coalition of more moderate constitutional monarchists took control of the Chamber of Deputies. With the king's assent, the government gradually began easing restrictions on civil and political liberties, including, crucially, the relaxation of press censorship. Lafayette had, of course, always supported freedom of the press, in theory if not in practice. I think back to his dispute with Jean-Paul Marat during the Revolution, as we discussed in Part 10 of this series. However, in the current political environment, he considered press freedom to be more important now than ever. It became a sort of hobby horse for him, an issue he devoted much of his time and energy towards, similar to the abolition of slavery or maintaining the Franco-American alliance had been in years past. To that point, he supported the cause of a free press materially by financially backing one of the several new publications that emerged in France after the laws were relaxed, one called the European Censor. This journal is most noteworthy for publishing works by Jean-Baptiste Say and Augustin Thierry, two men lauded for their liberal approaches to the study of economics and history, respectively. One of the changes that Louis XVIII made to the electoral system in 1816 after dissolving the Chamber of Deputies was to mandate that legislative elections take place annually in 1/5 of the nation's departments. The department of Seine-et-Marne, in which Lagrange was located, was slated to hold an election in autumn of 1817. Some of Lafayette's friends urged him to stand for election. His chances at winning appeared favorable, at least at first glance. He had won an election in his home district 2 years prior, during the 100 Days, and if anything, his popularity among the people in the area had only increased in the time since. To begin with, he had started to publicly distance himself from the aristocracy. He no longer referred to himself by his official noble title, and would eventually insist that others address him only as general, rather than Marquis. He also began to dress in the style of the middle class, abandoning his knee breeches and powdered wigs for the trousers and overcoats that became prominent in 19th century fashion. General Lafayette's efforts to appear as a man of the common people went beyond these superficial signifiers. Earlier that year, when crop failures threatened the area with famine, Lafayette was proactive in organizing relief efforts, providing food for the poorest of his neighbors from his own storehouses. This was emblematic of the egalitarian manner in which he treated commoners overall, as Lady Morgan illustrates in her book. Quote, "I was struck with his gracious manners to the peasants and the workmen engaged in the various offices within his domain. He almost always addressed them as my friend or my good man. The women, whom he addresses as my lovely lady or my good mother, are invited to display the products of their cream pans and cheese presses, or to parade their turkeys and ducks around for our amusement. Every Sunday evening, the peasantry of the neighborhood is invited into the spacious dining room of his house to dance to the violin, and are regaled with cakes and other confections. The general and his family are always present at these rustic balls. The young people occasionally dance among the tenants, setting the example of new steps freshly imported from Paris. This kindness is repaid in boundless affection and respect amounting almost to veneration." And so Lafayette put himself forward as a candidate in September 1817, confident that the people of his district stood solidly behind him. The results were disheartening. He lost the election by a wide margin. His greatest mistake was to underestimate the extent to which those in power despised him. The government had gone so far as to send agents to the polls to induce people to vote against him. Reflecting on his loss, Lafayette later wrote, quote, "They said, without a doubt to make me unpopular, that I was the tricolor flag itself. The words liberty, equality, and fraternity, instead of electrifying the masses, awaken fearful memories that our opponents know how to make the most of." End quote. Still, true to his character, Lafayette refused to allow the result of this election to discourage him. Rather, he prepared to run again the next year. He now understood the obstacles that stood in his way. If he was to overcome them, he would need allies. To this end, Lafayette consulted with a number of members of the liberal opposition already in the Chamber of Deputies. Some key figures in this emergent faction were Jacques Lafitte, a very successful and prominent banker, Marc-René de Voyer d'Argenson, a retired army officer who formerly served under Lafayette as an aide-de-camp in 1792, and who helped work to bring about his release from prison after his defection, and Victor, the Duke of Broglie. If that name, the Duke of Broglie, sounds vaguely familiar to you, it is because he was the grandson of Victor Francois, Duke of Broglie, the man who had helped arrange Lafayette's journey to America in 1777. In the months leading up to the next legislative election in October 1818, Lafayette and his compatriots worked tirelessly to devise a strategy. Writing to a friend just weeks before the election, George Washington Lafayette remarked that all the activity at Lagrange had made the place feel like a campaign headquarters. Quote, "For 2 months now we have been living at Lagrange the life of Paris, what with the quantity of people that we receive." End quote. Since he could not run in his home district, Lafayette decided to stand for election in Paris, or rather a specific precinct of the city. The logic behind this was straightforward enough. Lafayette could draw considerable support from the middle-class urban dwellers who made up a sizable block of the city's electorate. The way that he and his allies saw it, the success of this strategy depended on Lafayette regaining the credibility that he'd lost during the chaotic events of 1791 and 1792. Fortunately for him, he was friends with several prominent writers who were more than happy to help him launder his reputation. The most effective of these was perhaps Benjamin Constant, the ex-Bonapartist political theorist. In July 1818, Constant published an article in the liberal journal La Minerve praising Lafayette for his integrity, sincerity, and above all, his steadfast advocacy of liberal principles. Here I will quote at length from Kramer's synopsis of this article. Quote, "The first of these articles was a review of Madame de Staël's posthumously published Considerations on the Principal Events of the French Revolution, from which Constant excerpted a long passage concerning Lafayette's role in the Revolution. De Staël described his willingness to sacrifice his fortune for his convictions and his resolute support for unchanging principles. She compared his disinterested attitude to the leadership of George Washington. She stressed his refusal to be swayed by the vanity of class or power. She noted the hatred and criticism from his opponents never made him bitter, and she emphasized his confidence in the triumph of liberty, which resembled a pious man's faith in the afterlife." Constant cited all of this approvingly and offered up his own opinion. The Friends of Liberty, some of whom were formerly unfair to him, know today that this portrait is accurate. The enemies of liberty know it just as well, and it is for this reason they use every occasion to slander and dispose of a man they know they cannot discourage, nor intimidate, nor seduce." End quote. All told, the panegyrics written by Constant and others did greatly contribute to the rehabilitation of Lafayette's public image as he prepared to return to the political stage for the long term. That said, these efforts were ineffective against their real opponents, those in the halls of power. Constant was not exaggerating the degree to which the king and his ministers, despite their seemingly more moderate agenda, still considered Lafayette a threat. Already we've seen how they were willing to resort to more or less open election interference to keep him out of the legislature a year prior. The organizing efforts of Lafayette and his allies had not gone unnoticed. The king expressed his concern in a letter to the Minister of Police. Quote, "These fellows speak of the possibility of the election of that animal Lafayette with an assurance that almost rattles my own." End quote. Lafayette's potential victory in the upcoming election was considered especially worrisome in light of the current diplomatic situation. The great powers of Europe, namely Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, were on the verge of fully welcoming France into the so-called Concert of Europe, an unofficial agreement between the aforementioned great powers to maintain peace, order, and stability in Europe. A diplomatic conference in the city of Aix-la-Chapelle, more commonly known by its German name of Aachen, was planned for early October, coinciding with the election, with the main item on the agenda being the withdrawal of Allied troops from France. If you'll recall from the last episode, the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1815 stipulated that the occupation would last for at least 5 years. The government had placed a lot of hope in the success of this conference, so much so that they dispatched the Prime Minister, the Duc de Richelieu, to head the French delegation. And yes, this Duc de Richelieu was indeed a distant relation of the more famous Cardinal Richelieu, who exercised great influence over the affairs of state in France in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Anyway, the French government was concerned that if former revolutionaries, especially one as infamous as Lafayette, began rising to prominence again, it would signal to the Allies that France could not, in fact, be trusted to look after its own internal stability, and they would opt to maintain their occupation of the country. With the stakes this high, the government once again took measures to ensure Lafayette's defeat. As Georges told a friend, quote, "They used every means at their disposal, threats, promises, bribes, etc." End quote. As it turned out, standing for election in Paris did have one significant drawback. It made it easier for government agents to suppress the vote. Fortunately for Lafayette, there was a backup plan in place. Now, this is where things become a bit convoluted, and 19th century French electoral law is not a subject that I claim to have expertise in, but I'll do my best to explain things as best I understand them. In northwestern France, there is a department called the Sarthe, a mostly rural and historically conservative area. For months, a fiery and energetic lawyer named Charles Goyer had worked tirelessly to campaign for liberal candidates for the legislature. In April, Goyer contacted Lafayette, asking permission to nominate him as one of the candidates on whose behalf he was organizing. This was legal, as France did not have residency requirements for those holding elected office, and what's more, it would be far more difficult for the government to suppress the vote in the provinces. Even so, Lafayette was concerned that his complete lack of ties to the Sarthe, he had never so much as visited the area, would be a liability. So he made an arrangement with Goyer that if he lost the election in Paris, Goyer would nominate him for election in the Sarthe at the last moment. Surely enough, as soon as the results of the election in Paris were announced, Lafayette dispatched a messenger to inform Goyer, and the plan was put into motion. In my understanding, here is how they pulled it off. Goyer nominated 4 candidates to stand for election in various districts within the Sarthe. All 4 won, but one of them was intended to act as a placeholder candidate who would drop out if Lafayette lost in Paris. In this event, the Electoral College would have to meet to choose a replacement, which would delay the proceedings long enough for Lafayette to be nominated in his place. A runoff election was held a week later on October 30th, in which Lafayette won with a plurality of votes. Allies and adversaries alike made much of Lafayette's election to the Chamber of Deputies. Those who fell into the former category were elated that such a stalwart champion of liberty would once more enter into a position of influence, and that they had struck a blow against royal absolutism. It is true that Lafayette's election did cause no small degree of angst for Louis XVIII and his ministers, especially seeing as how they believed that they had thwarted his attempt at a comeback not even a week prior. Prime Minister Richelieu, still at Aix-la-Chapelle, lamented Lafayette's victory, writing, quote, "The effect is dreadful here. No doubt more than one of these gentlemen will regret having signed the treaty." End quote. One of Lafayette's biographers would later claim, quote, "The election of Lafayette shook all of France, indeed all of Europe. The Crown had done its best to defeat him. Its agents had swarmed across the Sarthe. When the results were announced at Paris, there was consternation at the Tuileries. Louis XVIII could not hide his disappointment and chagrin. Through his entourage there ran a shiver of fear, as though Lafayette were about to plunge the nation back into revolution, and they would all be obliged once more to take the dreary road into exile." End quote. Their fears were overblown. The Allies at Aix-la-Chapelle, aware that their occupation was rather unpopular with the French people, nonetheless agreed to withdraw their armies. They also implemented a secret protocol stipulating that they would intervene directly if revolution were to break out in France again, thereby easing the fears of Richelieu and his superiors. After some further negotiations around the remainder of France's debt, a treaty was drawn up and the withdrawal of Allied occupation forces began a few weeks later. The first session of the new Chamber of Deputies took place on December 10, 1818. The occasion made quite a stir among Parisian society. People of all classes stood in line outside the Palais Bourbon for the chance to see the hero of two worlds take the oath of office. Some were genuinely enthusiastic about Lafayette's return to the political stage. As I said earlier, the public relations campaign his allies undertook on his behalf had done much to restore his good name. Others were motivated purely by curiosity. Lafayette may not have spent the last 2 decades in complete seclusion, but he had been rarely seen in Paris during that time, especially since the 100 Days. To liberal-minded people of the younger generation, who had grown up hearing stories about the glory days of 1789, this was the chance to see a living legend up close. In any case, even though the king himself was in attendance that day, Lafayette was the center of attention. Lady Morgan wrote about this dynamic, quote, "When he entered, every eye turned on him, and every tongue spoke his name as admiration, fear, or hope dictated." End quote. He remained in the spotlight each time the chamber reconvened. Lafayette quickly became the unofficial leader of the liberal faction in the legislature. This was through no effort of his own. In the earliest days of his term, he rarely spoke during debates. In fact, he did not address the chamber at all until March of 1819. The subject was a bill proposed by the Royalists that would impose new restrictions on voting rights and press freedom. Lafayette took the opportunity to deliver a prolonged lecture about the sanctity of personal liberty and representative democracy, while the ultra-royalists in the chamber tried to shout him down. One monarchist newspaper later published insults about him that were so obscene, the prosecutor general indicted the author for libel. Demonstrating the strength of his commitment to freedom of the press, Lafayette asked the charges be dropped, stating, quote, "During the 42 years of my life that have been subject to public judgment, I have asked no writer to speak well of me, nor bothered anybody for speaking ill of me, and furthermore, although very sensitive to praise, I have never answered calumny." End quote. Although the Liberal Party and the moderate doctrinaire faction to their right held most of the seats in the Chamber of Deputies, they made distressingly slow progress in enacting their reformist agenda, mainly due to the obstinate refusal of the king and his ministers to cooperate with them. In an address he made to the chamber in June of 1819, Lafayette warned his royalist colleagues that by stubbornly resisting even gradual reforms, they were making the very same mistake that their predecessors had in the run-up to the Revolution. His argument hinged on the contention that the Revolution had produced positive outcomes in several regards. Quote, "Despite all that was lost by anarchy, terrorism, bankruptcy, and civil war, despite a terrible struggle against all of Europe, there remains an indisputable truth that the agriculture, the industry, the public education, the freedom of the population have improved to a degree of which there is no equivalent in history." End quote. Citing the failed reforms of Turgot, Necker, Brienne, and others, he went on to argue that the aforementioned benefits of the Revolution might have been accomplished without so much bloodshed if those in power hadn't been so short-sighted. Lafayette's reactionary adversaries understood the Revolution and its causes in a much different way. As they saw things, the Ancien regime had been too permissive and too open to liberal reform. The limited concessions they did make only encouraged the radicals to take things even further. With this fear in their minds, the Crown monitored the political situation closely, aiming to limit liberal influence as much as they were able. The next round of legislative elections held in the autumn of 1819 saw several more liberal candidates win seats in the Chamber of Deputies. One of them was Lafayette's close friend and ally Benjamin Constant, also elected as his deputy from the Department of the Sarthe with the assistance of Goyer. Far more concerning to the Crown was the election of Abbé Henri Gregoire in the Department of Isère. Gregoire is one of the most noteworthy figures of the revolutionary period, with ideas that were truly ahead of their time in regards to racial equality and religious toleration. Looking back through my script, I was surprised to note that I never had cause to discuss him, especially seeing as how he's sort of been on the periphery of our narrative the whole time. He was one of the founding members of the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, the abolitionist group of which Lafayette was also a part. He participated in the Estates General and the National Convention. In the latter capacity, he was the first to openly demand that Louis XVI be brought to trial. It was Gregoire's involvement in the trial of the former king that made his election so controversial. There was a law in place that expressly barred regicides, or individuals who had voted for the death of Louis XVI, from holding public office. Actually, Gregoire was not present in France during the trial itself, as he was on a diplomatic assignment in Italy at the time. He wrote a letter to his colleagues in the convention, expressing his approval of the guilty verdict for the king, but urged them not to seek the death penalty, to which he was opposed in principle. In short, he did not, in point of fact, vote for the king's execution. Nonetheless, Gregoire was popularly thought of as a regicide, hence why the government was so anxious to block him from taking a seat in the legislature. Lafayette had had his disagreements with Gregoire in the past. It's fair to say that the Abbé was a fair bit more radical than Lafayette was back in 1792. But in the present moment, during this period of reaction, those on the left could not so easily afford to be divided by such internecine differences. This isn't to say that some disputes didn't still happen. The liberals were split on whether to support Gregoire's candidacy, with some worried that his election would give the right a pretext to cancel future elections. Lafayette, on the other hand, openly encouraged Gregoire to run, and after the election, he disagreed strongly with his fellow party members who wanted the Abbé to resign immediately. The matter was taken up in the Chamber of Deputies on December 6th. Lafayette spoke up in defense of Gregoire, arguing that the accusations of regicide were untrue, that Gregoire had been legitimately elected and had every right to take his seat, and so on. He went on for hours, only stopping after 2 o'clock the next morning, but it was no use. The king directed the prime minister to annul the results of Gregoire's election. At that point, the leaders of the liberal opposition reasoned that it wasn't worth the risk to challenge this decision, and they dropped the issue. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. Going into the year 1820, the position of the left in French politics, while far from ideal, did not appear to be completely hopeless. Lafayette was still reasonably confident that they might be able to enact the reforms they wanted through legal means. That is, until February 13th. That night, the Duke of Berry, the son of the Comte d'Artois and the nephew of Louis XVIII, was stabbed and mortally wounded as he and his wife left an opera house. His death hit the House of Bourbon particularly hard, as he was third in the line of succession. Given the fact that the king and his current heir presumptive were 65 and 63 years old, respectively, there was now a real chance that the throne could pass to the House of Orleans, a prospect that the ultra-royalists dreaded. At the same time, the assassination of the Duc de Berry presented them with an opportunity to initiate a crackdown against the growing influence of the left. The perpetrator was a disgruntled veteran of the Napoleonic Wars named Louis Lovell, a saddlemaker by profession. He was immediately apprehended and subjected to months of interrogation, in the course of which it was determined that he had acted alone. His motives went no deeper than his own personal animosity towards the current regime for his downward social and economic mobility. The authorities were nonetheless determined to pin the blame for the Duke's murder on the left, and eventually Lovell gave them something that they could work with. When asked about what literature could have inspired his actions, the culprit allegedly responded, "The Declaration of the Rights of Man." The authorities promptly seized on this, claiming that Lovell had, by his own admission, been incited to murder by the left-wing press. New, tighter censorship laws were enacted on this pretext, however questionable it may have been. This was only the beginning of the reactionary backlash. Worse was yet to come. In the aftermath of the assassination, a whole slate of new laws were passed, which placed increasingly more onerous restrictions on freedom of speech, assembly, and on suffrage. The most egregious of these was a new electoral law, unofficially called the Law of the Double Vote, which, to drastically oversimplify things, allowed the ultra-wealthy to vote twice. Lafayette, only 2 years into his 5-year term in the Chamber of Deputies, tried to utilize his platform to protest this reactionary overreach. A month after the assassination, Lafayette gave a speech at a session of the chamber, accusing the government of violating the Charter of 1814 with its recent actions, stating, quote, "To violate the Charter is to annul it. To annul it would be to dissolve the mutual guarantees between the nation and the throne." End quote. 2 months later, on May 15th, he issued a far more dire warning, stating, quote, "Our contemporaries are tired of revolutions, of disorder, but they will not stand idly by while they are robbed of the liberties that they fought so hard to win. Do not force them, by threatening the loss of all useful results of the revolution, to seize for themselves the sacred fasces of the principles of eternal truth and sovereign justice, principles integral to all free governments, and to which all other political considerations must be secondary." End quote. A somewhat clunky speech. Lafayette was never considered a great orator, either by himself or others, but the gist of what he was saying was that the people of France, especially the youth, would not allow the government to deprive them of their rights, and that if they were pushed far enough, they would have no choice but to resort to direct action. As a point of fact, this was already happening. That same day, hundreds of university students staged a protest just down the street in support of press freedom. Cavalry troops charged in to disperse the demonstration, cracking some heads and arresting 9 alleged ringleaders. Lafayette's opponents accused him of inciting rebellion with his inflammatory rhetoric. After his address in the chamber, an elderly royalist deputy rose to denounce him, saying, quote, "When civil war breaks out, the blood spilled is on the head of he who provoked it. The speaker knows that better than anyone. He has learned more than once, with death in his soul and shame on his brow, that he who rouses raging mobs is eventually obliged to follow them." End quote. Lafayette retorted that it was the royalists who were responsible for inciting the unrest outside, not himself. Quote, "It seems to me the aristocracy is getting angry, like women who become upset with the artist who paints their portrait." End quote. Ultimately, Lafayette's warnings went unheeded, and the government continued to pursue its reactionary agenda. Several left-leaning newspapers were forced to stop printing due to the new censorship laws. Ironically, the European Censor, the publication that Lafayette was financially backing, was one of them. Lafayette helped to organize a committee called the Society of Friends of the Press, intended to support independent publications and organize public protest, but its effectiveness was limited. The law of the double vote was ratified in June, allowing the ultra-royalists to make significant gains in that year's round of legislative elections. The ultra-royalists now assumed control of the legislature, and would likely remain in control there for the foreseeable future. For Lafayette and the other Friends of Liberty in France, the state of domestic politics appeared dire indeed. However, events elsewhere in Europe still inspired hope. In January 1820, 4 regiments of the Spanish army assembled in the port city of Cadiz, in preparation for an expedition to reconquer Spain's American colonies, were led in a mutiny by a clique of liberal army officers. The rebellious troops then marched on the capital city of Madrid and forced King Ferdinand VII to accept a liberal constitution. The success of the Cadiz mutiny inspired similar revolts against absolutist rule in Italy, Germany, Portugal, and most significantly in Greece. Writing to his old friend James Monroe, who was elected as President of the United States in 1816, Lafayette spoke excitedly about these developments and what they could potentially mean for his own country. Quote, "The ideas of liberty are fermenting everywhere, and France is participating a great deal. Revolution and counter-revolution are face to face." End quote. In another letter to an unknown recipient written around the same time, Lafayette expressed his admiration of the rebels elsewhere in Europe. Quote, "Only a few regiments were needed to march on Madrid. 150 men managed the business in Naples, and it only took 3 drunks in Berlin to stir up a crowd to make the King of Prussia remember a few things." End quote. His attention to the fact that these revolutionary changes were brought about by relatively small groups of people indicates a shift in Lafayette's thinking that was reflected in a large proportion of the liberal coalition in the early 1820s, a shift away from legal methods of political opposition, parliamentary proceedings, electoral campaigns, and the like, towards methods that were illegal, clandestine, and insurrectionary. In a word, conspiracy. This change is understandable in light of the current political situation. The right had made every effort to shut anyone but the most strident royalists out of the halls of power, and they had largely succeeded in this. Common people were unable to participate in the political process in a meaningful way. The continued existence of the Chamber of Deputies was only to maintain a pretense of representative government. Lafayette pointed out to his fellow deputies in June 1819 that the situation in many ways resembled the late 1780s. Conditions had made revolutionary unrest all but inevitable. The first half of the 1820s would see a number of uprisings aimed at either forcing the king to adopt a new liberal constitution or forcing him off the throne altogether. Every one of them failed. As the authorities worked to untangle the web of conspiracies surrounding these insurrectionary activities, there was one name that constantly popped up: Lafayette. The nature of these conspiracies is such that historians have difficulty recreating a comprehensive account of Lafayette's involvement. As one might imagine, he and his co-conspirators did not leave behind a trove of potentially incriminating documents. All of this is to say that things might get convoluted again, but I'll try my best to keep the narrative focused. The first major attempted insurrection in France to take place after the assassination of the Duke of Berry and subsequent reactionary crackdown occurred on August 19, 1820. A group of radical students from the Sorbonne University, together with like-minded young army officers, tried to essentially recreate the Cadiz mutiny that had occurred in Spain earlier that year. The would-be mutineers assembled at a partially dismantled fort on the outskirts of Paris, from which they would march on the capital, rally the freedom-loving citizens of France to their banner, and force the king to comply with their demands. The plot was hastily thought up and poorly organized, and predictably, it was foiled before it could truly commence. The authorities were tipped off by an informant the night before, and immediately started arresting the ringleaders. When the other conspirators learned this, they quickly dispersed to avoid the police dragnet. As far as historians know, Lafayette's involvement in this particular plot was minimal. Some of the students had been affiliated with his Society of Friends of the Press, and he did offer shelter to some of the fugitives after the plot was uncovered. The authorities suspected that Lafayette had a greater hand in the events of August 19th, but were unable to prove it. In the immediate term, the failure of the plot of August 19th was detrimental to the liberal opposition. The existence of the conspiracy lent credibility to the constant accusations from the right that supposedly respectable liberals like Lafayette were secretly fomenting disorder. The government took more active measures to stymie the opposition's ability to organize, most notably by breaking up any large gatherings they deemed to be subversive. At one point, Lafayette was brought to trial for holding such a meeting. He defended himself by arguing that the law placing limits on the size of political gatherings was antithetical to the charter that the government ostensibly existed to uphold. Quote, "That article is so incompatible with any constitutional regime that in applying it to these meetings or any other of this kind, I would have assumed that I was contradicting the charter and ridiculing the government." End quote. He was ultimately acquitted, but this was not the end of his legal battles with the government. Ironically, the heavy-handed response by the government pushed more members of the liberal opposition to devote greater time and effort towards clandestine organizing. It was in early 1821 that a new network of revolutionaries would begin to take root in France, the Carbonari. The origins of this secret society are somewhat murky. The name Carbonari, or in French the Charbonnerie, literally means charcoal burners, and according to the group's lore, they originated as a sort of mutual aid society of rural peasant charcoal manufacturers who banded together to resist exploitative feudal lords. Historians postulate that the Carbonari likely began as an offshoot of the Freemasons, and it isn't difficult to see why. The group share many similarities in terms of their belief and their practices. Like the Freemasons, the ideology of the Carbonari, insofar as it can be said to have had one, was heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. They opposed absolutism and aimed to establish a republic or constitutional monarchy founded on notions of liberty. Also, like the Freemasons, the Carbonari operated in strict secrecy and relied on mystical symbolism and rituals to keep their activities hidden, some of which they borrowed directly from the Freemasons. Perhaps the most fundamental difference between the Carbonari and the Freemasons is that throughout their existence, the Carbonari were an explicitly militant organization, dedicated to direct revolutionary action. In order to join, each prospective member had to make 4 pledges. First, to keep the organization secret. Second, to pay 1 franc a month to the order's treasury. Third, to keep a firearm and at least 25 rounds of ammunition nearby at all times. And fourth, to be ready to act on orders from leadership at any moment. The militant character of the Carbonari can be explained by the fact that the group first became active in resistance to French rule in Italy, specifically in the Kingdom of Naples, the Napoleonic puppet state centered in the south of the country. After the fall of Napoleon's empire, the Carbonari continued to lead armed resistance to absolutist monarchs installed across Italy by the Allied powers. In July 1820, they were instrumental in organizing a successful rebellion against King Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies, sending him fleeing from his capital of Naples. After the botched insurrection of August 19th in France, a few of the conspirators managed to escape to Italy. There they established contact with the Italian Carbonari, who were more than happy to induct their French comrades into the order. After receiving instruction in revolutionary strategy and tactics, these men returned to France early the next year and immediately got to work organizing a French chapter of the Carbonari. It isn't known how Lafayette first became aware of the Carbonari's activities in France, but he became involved almost immediately, and it was not long before he found himself serving on the organization's central committee. Now, I should point out here that the Carbonari are historically noteworthy for having pioneered the use of clandestine cell systems, of the sort that are still used by insurgent groups and intelligence networks to this day. The underlying idea is simple. Contact between individual members of the Carbonari was restricted to small working groups, or cells. Only one member of each cell would be in contact with the next cell in the hierarchy. Therefore, if an individual member revealed information to the police, voluntary or otherwise, they could not identify anyone outside their immediate cell. Even individuals at the very top of the organization's hierarchy, like Lafayette, did not know the precise identities of all members. The ranks of the Carbonari grew quickly through the year 1821. Lafayette was only one of several prominent members of the liberal opposition who became involved with the organization during this time. However, not everyone approved of the direction that things seemed to be heading in. Charles Goyer, the lawyer who ran Lafayette's successful election campaign in the Sarthe, thought that it was a mistake to resort to such illegal activities. Writing to Benjamin Constant in the wake of the August 19th conspiracy, he stated, quote, "It is up to us who have never conspired, who will never conspire, to defend the charter by our writing. Sooner or later, enlightened public opinion will be able to accomplish what conspiracies never could." End quote. Goyer would be given cause to rethink this belief a short time later when, in November 1820, he was arrested, ironically on suspicion that he was involved in the August 19th insurrection. Upon searching his house, they discovered a cache of letters which, they claimed, proved that Lafayette did in fact plan the insurrection, and that Goyer had prior knowledge of it but refused to participate. When Goyer was brought to trial, Lafayette was called to testify. When asked to confirm whether he had written certain excerpts from these letters, Lafayette confirmed authorship but refused to comment further on evidence that he thought was seized illegally. When the judge chided him for the sentiments expressed in these letters, saying that his views were, quote, destructive to public order, end quote, Lafayette, unrepented, responded simply, quote, "You have that opinion, I have another. Let Europe decide between us," end quote. Goyer was ultimately acquitted. Charges were never brought against Lafayette. In fact, despite having several opportunities to do so, prosecutors repeatedly declined to bring charges against Lafayette, primarily because they were concerned that such an action would harm the government's credibility. Lafayette took full advantage of this unofficial legal immunity to continually rail against the government in the Chamber of Deputies. For him, the drawn-out trials of the August 19th conspirators only served to further convince him that the nation's liberty could not be defended through legal channels. He said as much publicly in a speech in the chamber on June 2nd. In this speech, he excoriated the deputies for having forgotten the decrepitness and corruption of the Ancien regime that they clearly longed for the return of. Quote, "What do we miss from that regime? Taxes imposed arbitrarily by a king? The capitulation tax? The sales taxes? The criminal justice system that sanctioned torture? Religious intolerance, which reduced a great proportion of the population to live in common law marriages? Courts staffed with venal judges? Tithes and feudal privileges? Letters of cachet? Offices without function? That, countrymen, was the Ancien regime, whose destruction has made you as unaware of the advantages of the revolution as you are of the very air that you breathe, whose re-establishment was the avowed purpose of the emigration to Koblenz, and whose spirit continues to drive the more or less hidden government of the court, which, since 1814, has taken no heed of the nation's future. I once hoped that barriers had been erected to prevent the resurrection of the Ancien regime. Now this hope is completely destroyed. Not only do I admit it, but I believe I must declare it. After having, since the last session, pointed out the counter-revolution's invasion of all our rights, and the new order of duties which, in my opinion, would result for us, after having fought within established institutions the dogma of parliamentary omnipotence, and now that the counter-revolution has seized them, I limit myself to recognizing openly the powerlessness of these institutions to save the nation." End quote. Lafayette's more or less open call to insurrection generated quite a bit of controversy, which was his intention. His more moderate friends and allies worried that he was tempting fate with such incendiary rhetoric. The banker, Jacques Lafitte, cautioned him, quote, "You are a statue in search of a pedestal. It would not matter much to you if it were a scaffold." End quote. In response, Lafayette remarked, quote, "I have lived a long time. It seems that I should end my career worthily if I did so on the scaffold as a martyr for liberty." End quote. As I mentioned already, the French chapter of the Carbonari saw remarkable success in their recruitment efforts through 1821. The extent to which Lafayette's speech in the Chamber of Deputies contributed to this success is uncertain, but taking into consideration the restrictive censorship laws in place at that time, its effect was probably somewhat limited. Looking at the current state of French society more broadly, conditions were ideal for recruitment. One event in particular aided the liberal opposition greatly, that being the death of Napoleon Bonaparte on May 5th of that year. The former emperor, even in the final days of his life, could not find it in his heart to forgive Lafayette, nor any of the men who he felt betrayed him during the 100 Days for that matter. Aiming to condemn him for the sake of posterity, Napoleon stated, quote, "Lafayette was yet another fool, a simpleton. He did not understand. He was simply not cut out for the role that he wanted to play. His scruples and naivete allowed him to be duped by everyone." End quote. Fortunately for Lafayette, these comments of Napoleon's were not published in France until several years later, enabling him to make the most of his old adversary's passing. Although the chances of Napoleon returning to power in France again were rather remote, his death did put a definitive end to any such hopes that his die-hard supporters, and there were still quite a few of them, clung on to. From that point onward, Bonapartists were more receptive to the idea of working with liberals like Lafayette to undermine the Bourbons, and vice versa. Lafayette extended an olive branch to the Bonapartists almost immediately when, shortly after the news of his death reached France, a number of his former officers submitted a petition before the Chamber of Deputies to call on the British government to return his body to his homeland. Lafayette made a point to be the first deputy to speak in favor of the bill. Neither the British or French governments were amenable to the proposal and refused to act on it. Napoleon's remains would not be transferred from St. Helena to France until 1840. But Lafayette's gesture did go a long way towards reconciling the Bonapartists with the rest of the liberal opposition. Military officers who previously served under Napoleon joined the Carbonari in droves. Some were still in active service, others were retired, but all of them shared a burning resentment of the Bourbons and a longing for the glory days of the Empire. These officers likely formed the second largest contingent of the French Carbonari behind university students, though given the nature of the organization it's difficult to say for certain. In any case, the uprising that the Carbonari were planning for relied on these military officers, arguably too much so. The details of their plan were finalized in the last weeks of 1821. The first phase of the uprising would be launched on December 29th in the eastern French town of Belfort, near the border with Switzerland. The town hosted a large army garrison. At that time, the particular regiment stationed there, coincidentally the 29th, had been infiltrated by Carbonarist officers. They were confident that they would be able to incite the regiment to stage a mutiny. Meanwhile, Lafayette's ally and former aide-de-camp, Marquis de Lafayette d'Argenson, who represented the district in the Chamber of Deputies, would convince the civilian population to join them. Then, Lafayette would serendipitously appear at Belfort and be acclaimed as the leader of a provisional revolutionary government. Other Carbonari cells across the country were given instructions to stage local uprisings of their own as soon as they received word that Belfort had gone into revolt. The most crucial actions, or at least those most extensively planned, would take place in a handful of other cities where significant numbers of troops were stationed: La Rochelle, Marseille, Toulon, Saumur, and of course, Paris. The revolt would cascade in this manner to engulf the entire nation in short order. The Bourbons would be overwhelmed and would have little choice but to capitulate. At least, that was the idea. In terms of overall strategy, the plan was hardly more sophisticated than the plot of August 19th. The conspirators were leaving a lot to chance. Any small mistake, a lapse of communication, a transportation delay, a betrayal from within the ranks, could cause the plan to unravel. Even the usually optimistic Lafayette had his misgivings, especially after December 23rd when, 5 days before the uprising was to begin, police in Saumur discovered a conspiracy among the cadets at the local military academy. The authorities correctly suspected that this was only part of a wider conspiracy, although they did not know all the details. Army garrisons across the country were put on high alert as a precaution. Lafayette was in contact with the conspirators at Belfort, who reassured him that they were ready and able to carry out the plan on the agreed date, maybe even sooner. They awaited his order, but he was not prepared to act immediately. In fact, he pushed back the starting date to January 1st. See, Lafayette, as we know by now, was not spiritually inclined in the slightest, but he did have one trait that reads as superstitious. He ascribed great significance to anniversaries of events in his life, and he commemorated these events in particular ways every year if he was able. December 24th was the day that his wife Adrienne died, and so, despite the urgency of the situation, Lafayette insisted on spending the entire day alone, locked inside her old bedroom, as he had done every year for 14 years since her passing. This delay may not have been so bad if a winter storm had not blown through the area at the same time that Lafayette and Georges departed Lagrange the next evening. The roads were so bad that they did not reach Belfort until New Year's Day, and by then it was already too late. As their carriage approached the city, 2 young army officers, riding their horses at full gallop, approached them and informed them that the plot had been exposed. As it turned out, the Carbonarists at Belfort had overestimated the sway that they held over the rank-and-file soldiers of the 29th Regiment and the extent to which they had infiltrated the officer corps. Enlisted men reported hearing suspicious conversations to their officers in the past few days. Then, on the morning of January 1st, the garrison's commandant stumbled upon a group of mutineers and ordered them to return to their quarters. An altercation ensued in which the commandant was shot and wounded, though not severely. The conspirators then tried to escape the area while the commandant raised the alarm and placed the city on lockdown. A few were arrested before they could get away, and more were tracked down in the countryside during the ensuing manhunt. Fortunately for Lafayette and Georges, the 2 Carbonarists who had intercepted them outside the city had done so before the authorities could take notice of their presence. They quickly turned around and stopped at a home of a friend who lived a couple towns over. Lafayette then sent his coach driver to Belfort to track down a parcel that he had sent there ahead of him, containing his old National Guard uniform. The driver was instructed to burn it, along with a cache of documents that might be able to connect Lafayette to the conspiracy. Of the several revolutionary plots schemed up by the liberal opposition in France between 1820 and 1824, the Belfort conspiracy was by far the broadest in scope and most extensively planned, and yet it was snuffed out before it began all the same. Nonetheless, it was not the last of them. In the aftermath of its failure, a few other plots, all of a smaller scale, came to light. In February 1822, as the trial of the alleged conspirators of Saumur began, some 150 disgruntled soldiers led by a cavalry commander and veteran of the Napoleonic Wars named Jean-Baptiste Berton marched on the town in a desperate attempt to free the accused cadets. Berton declared the establishment of a provisional government and called on the patriotic citizens of Western France to join him. However, his rebellion was doomed from the very beginning. Within a matter of days, he and his men were sent fleeing in all directions ahead of a regiment of loyalist troops. Berton himself went into hiding and managed to evade capture for 5 months. When the police finally did manage to arrest him in June, they lured him out into the open using a police spy, pretending to be an agent of Lafayette. This suggests that the authorities already suspected that Lafayette was involved in these intrigues, and at Berton's trial in September, the prosecution hoped to prove it. A man who claimed to be a member of the Carbonari was called in as a witness. He testified that he had personally met General Lafayette, who tasked him with delivering funds and written instructions to co-conspirators. However, when asked to describe Lafayette's physical appearance, he stated that he was a short, pot-bellied man with long black whiskers. This was a highly inaccurate description, but the witness refused to change his testimony even after thorough cross-examination. The jury concluded that the man he claimed to have met was only impersonating the general, and therefore no charges could be brought against him. Berton, however, was not so lucky. He was convicted of treason and executed on October 5th. In the course of their investigation into General Berton, police discovered the existence of another Carbonari cell consisting of 4 non-commissioned officers stationed in the city of La Rochelle. Their names were Jean-François Bory, Jean-Joseph Pommier, Marius Claude Raoul, and Charles Gobain, aged 26, 25, 24, and 20 respectively. All 4 were arrested and brought to Paris, where they were extensively interrogated and, most likely tortured, for months before having their day in court. Once again, their captors hoped to learn the names of the Carbonari's leaders, but the 4 sergeants refused to implicate anyone but themselves. Each of them individually tried to claim full responsibility in the hopes that their comrades would receive lighter sentences. When their trial began shortly after the conclusion of Berton's, the ordeal of the 4 sergeants of La Rochelle inspired a lot of public sympathy, especially on account of their youth and the strength of their convictions. Ultimately, all 4 were found guilty of treason and were executed by guillotine on September 21st, 1822, cementing their status as martyrs for the cause of liberty. All told, 11 men received the death penalty as a result of their involvement with the Carbonari. A few more either received lengthy prison sentences or were sent into exile. Without exception, everyone who was prosecuted in these trials was relatively low in the organization's hierarchy. This would lead some to criticize Lafayette for allowing his subordinates to take the fall, while he himself escaped any serious repercussions. A radical journalist named Emile wrote a scathing critique of Lafayette along these lines in 1833. Quote, "Under the Restoration, the blood of the Carbonari, of whom he was one of the principal leaders, ran from the scaffold. In the many plots in which he took part, he always knew how to play this terrible game with the heads of others." End quote. To be fair to Lafayette, the deaths of these conspirators, especially the 4 young sergeants, did weigh heavily on his conscience, so much so that he made an ill-advised attempt to bribe a prison official to secure their release, only to be double-crossed and made 10,000 francs poorer for his trouble. Although it should be noted that he managed to avoid legal trouble for this action as well. Armand Carrel, another journalist and fellow Carbonarist, sought to exonerate Lafayette from the accusations that he had callously sacrificed these young men's lives. He instead contended that the Carbonari's grave mistake was relying on these young and inexperienced men in the first place. Quote, "All the young people who compromised themselves in the affairs of August 19th, of Belfort, Saumur, and La Rochelle, joined of their own account, knowing what they were doing and why they were devoting themselves. If they allowed themselves to be discovered before they had matured enough in their affairs, they are victims only of their own inexperience. Never did Lafayette, nor any of his political allies, make a profession of hiring sergeants, young officers, and university students, only to then abandon them to the guillotine of the Restoration. Why did we have the foolish idea that we could overthrow, by the plots of students and second lieutenants, a government supported by international law and an army of 200,000 men?" End quote. The executions of Berton and the 4 sergeants of La Rochelle effectively marked the end of the Carbonari's activities in France. Their ineptitude had left them completely discredited. Lafayette, feeling somewhat disheartened, became less engaged in politics at this time. It seemed that there was nothing that he could do, illegal or legal, to break the right-wing stranglehold on French politics. And it was not just in France that the forces of counter-revolution were ascendant, but across Europe. The series of uprisings that had begun with the Cadiz Mutiny, that had once inspired Lafayette and his allies, were being snuffed out one by one. The revolution in southern Italy led by the Carbonari was suppressed when Austrian troops forcibly occupied Naples and restored the absolutist King Ferdinand I to his throne. In Germany, the intricate system of surveillance and repression engineered by Austrian Chancellor Clemens von Metternich remained firmly in place despite the disorder in Berlin. In the East, the Greeks continued their struggle against the Ottoman Empire for independence, but their pleas for assistance from the great powers went unanswered, and it remained to be seen how long they could keep up the fight without support. Then, to compound this sense of helplessness, in April 1823, France, at the behest of the other great powers, invaded Spain with nearly 100,000 troops to restore the authority of King Ferdinand VII. In February, a measure was introduced in the Chamber of Deputies to authorize war credits in advance of the expedition. A deputy from the Vendée named Jacques-Antoine Manuel, also a close friend of Lafayette who sat alongside him on the Carbonari Central Committee, rose to speak against the intervention, stating that the King of Spain was a tyrant, his people were within their rights to overthrow him, and that France was dishonoring itself by taking his side. In the course of his diatribe, Manuel alluded to the events of 1792, declaring, quote, "Is it necessary for me to add that the danger of the royal family in France became much more serious when foreign forces invaded our territory, and that France, revolutionary France, feeling the need to defend herself by renewed force and energy," end quote. Manuel was shouted down by royalist deputies before he could reach his conclusion, though it's not hard to see where he was going with this particular line of thought. The right interpreted his words as a defense of regicide, and demanded that he be expelled from the chamber. Lafayette, straining to make his voice heard amid the tumult, shouted, quote, "We all adhere to what Monsieur Manuel has said to you. We make common cause with him," end quote. After 3 hours of loud and unproductive argument, the chamber was adjourned for the day. The next morning, Manuel had scarcely been able to take his seat before the president of the assembly demanded he leave. Manuel refused, saying that they would have to drag him out, or something to that effect. They obliged him and sent for a detachment of the National Guard, but when they arrived, Lafayette stood front and center. The former commander of the Guard expressed his great shame that the National Guard would dishonor themselves by assaulting a democratically elected representative. Even though it had been years since his tenure as commander of the National Guard had ended, the men of the Guard still held him in high esteem, at least enough to heed his words and depart without incident. The president of the assembly then called for the gendarmerie, the regular police, which had no qualms with grabbing the intransigent deputy and throwing him out onto the street. The 63 remaining liberal representatives, Lafayette included, walked out in solidarity, never to return. Their seats were left unoccupied until the next round of elections was held. Lafayette's term as deputy from the Sarthe came to an end in 1824. He decided to submit his name as a candidate in advance of the general election slated to take place in February of that year, but it's clear that this time he had no serious expectation of victory, nor was a backup plan in place like last time. The persistent efforts of the government to disenfranchise all but the wealthiest aristocrats had their intended effect. Lafayette lost to his royalist opponent, and despite the fact that the government was hardly making an effort to hide their electoral fraud, they did not secure the landslide victory they would have preferred. Nonetheless, they accomplished what they'd set out to. For Lafayette, this defeat, while undesirable, had hardly come as a disappointment. For some time now, Lafayette, despairing at the state of the old world, had once again cast his gaze towards the new. In a letter to a fellow veteran of the American War of Independence from late 1823, Lafayette wrote, quote, "I will soon be sent back to my department for the period of elections. Our liberty, soiled by the counter-revolution of Bonaparte and the Bourbons, will, I hope, be reborn in southern Europe, but if not, these lands, having no great democratic masses of their own to oppose the autocratic armies of the North, will fall prey to a new barbarian invasion, and leave all that is intelligent and generous surviving only in America. Meanwhile, our United States are prospering. Splendid federal republics are being organized in Mexico and South America, and the African population of Haiti is even making progress. There are, therefore, despite the Continental Coalition, great resources for the betterment of human destiny, and you will not, my dear Maurice, have left part of your jaw in the trenches of Yorktown in vain." End quote. Taking notice of the dismal state of affairs in Europe, American observers had begun to write to Lafayette encouraging him to visit the United States. One letter he received from an American journalist named William Lee read in part, quote, Do not let your love of your country force you to cling on to her until everything once great, noble, and useful shall be buried in the ruins of fanaticism and crime. Here you will be received with open arms as the friend of Washington, the early defender of our rights and liberties, and the proud head of the liberal party of all countries." End quote. At the time that he received this letter in December 1823, he was still a deputy in the legislature. In his reply, he said that while he appreciated the invitation, it would be irresponsible of him to leave France as long as he continued to hold elected office. Quote, "As long as duty and honor point out the field of action, can an old herald of the charge now sound a retreat?" End quote. An understandable sentiment, but the results of the general election held just 3 months later rendered this a moot point. Lafayette was no longer an elected official and thus would have felt no obligation, at least in this regard, to remain in the country. Then, in spring of 1824, Lafayette received a letter from an old friend, the President of the United States of America, James Monroe. Dated February 24th, this letter was a direct invitation from the President for Lafayette to visit the U.S. It read, in part, quote, "My dear General, I wrote to you about a fortnight since, a letter which I forwarded to you, in which I intimated my desire, in case you felt at liberty to come to the United States, to send a frigate to some port of France to bring you over. Since then, Congress has passed a resolution to that effect, expressing the affectionate attachment of the whole nation to you, and of their desire to see you again among us. At the period that you may deem proper to accept this invitation, please have the goodness to advise me, and a ship shall be immediately sent to the port of your choosing to carry you to the country of your adoption in early life, and which has always cherished the most grateful recollection of you and your important services." End quote. For Lafayette, this invitation could not have come at a more opportune moment. His political career had just come to an end, or so he thought. The situation in France and all of Europe had never appeared more hopeless. On the other hand, he had not set foot in his adopted country in 40 years, despite his ardent wishes to see for himself the proverbial tree of liberty that he had helped plant there. He was now 66 years old. For all he knew, this would be his final chance to visit the country he held so dear. And so, the hero of two worlds would spend the next several weeks preparing to make the voyage to America one last time. When we return in 2 weeks, we will cover Lafayette's triumphal final visit to the United States. We will have quite a lot of content to get through, and I plan to cover the entire thing in just one episode. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, it will be a longer episode than usual, so there is a chance there might be some delays in the release schedule, though I'm hoping that it doesn't come to that. Anyway, as usual, please direct any and all questions, comments, or concerns to my email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. Also check out the show's website or the Facebook page if you would like. Links will be in the episode's description. If you want to help out the show, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast listening platform of choice, or by purchasing some used books from me using the link in the episode's description. Anyway, that will be all for now. Until 2 weeks, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.
Citoyen pour le bien soutiendra. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. L'aristocrate protestera.